Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, to kick off my set of conversations about masculinity and femininity, I have a conversation with my friend Christian. I've known Christian for a couple of years now. We met at a church when I was still an evangelical, and we've always had really interesting conversations. And I asked him to come and talk about this topic specifically because in a previous conversation we had, it sort of planted the seeds of doubt in my mind about the masculine and feminine and how those played within churches. And I really enjoyed the conversation. It went a lot of interesting places. Definitely addressed sort of masculinity, femininity in evangelical circles. And we talked a little bit about the Mars Hills podcast. Well, a lot about the Mars Hills podcast. We covered a lot of topics, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope you will too. Christian.
Cassidy.
Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming to my house and doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So like always, I just sort of let people give a little introduction about themselves, who they are, for the audience who don't know you. So go ahead and give us a little intro.
Yeah, so my name is Christian Gascon. I'm from Hayward, California, now living in Tempe, Arizona, and I've been here for almost 11 years now. I'm a salesperson by day and also by night.
I was going to say vigilante
These
by
days,
night?
Yeah. No, it's a full-time job, and I have a lot of hobbies. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to share any of your hobbies?
Yeah. So jiu-jitsu, boxing, kickboxing. I've done that for probably 8 years now. Music, a lifelong musician. I'm an armchair philosopher.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, we're all. But I'm like the philosopher for fighters. I'm pretty blue collar when it comes to philosophy, I think. So, yeah. I like audiobooks. I don't like real books that much. I don't
really?
And I like podcasts, but I only have the bandwidth for a few. So, absolutely.
Well, and fun fact, you were the one who introduced me to Paul Vanderklay.
Yeah.
And now
It's so random, huh?
yeah, weird the things that happen, but yeah, now I'm in this weird world. I'm like, well, I have that to, I don't know, thank you for or blame you for. I'm not sure.
You can do either.
Both, yeah. Just depends on the day.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get into sort of the topic. I asked you to come here because I have been working through this idea of masculinity and femininity and trying to do it through my channel, but also just in life. And you were sort of the first person who brought up the idea of masculinity and femininity when you started talking about femininity and the evangelical church. So I'll kind of throw it to you so you can kind of get that started, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. I don't remember what I said, so you have to.
Well, all you said, and all I remember is you saying that you felt that the evangelical church was very feminine.
Uh-huh.
Like there was a lot of femininity in it. And I think that was the first time I realized I don't know what that means.
Yeah. I don't know what it means either. I think I probably heard someone else say it and I was like, yes. But I don't know. I think I've been thinking more about evangelicalism or the evangelical church. And, that's definitely been a topic in my mind a lot more as of late, especially with the Mars Hill podcast that I listened to.
Okay. Yeah. I was wondering if you had listened to that, because I listened to it too. Well, and you're still evangelical, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Because I am an ex-evangelical, if you will.
Yeah.
So I had a very interesting perspective listening to that, sort of being in this camp of like not anti-evangelical by any means, but sort of not identifying that way anymore. So tell me your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, again, I grew. It was so funny listening to that podcast because they're telling the story of Mark Driscoll, Pastor Mark Driscoll, and they have a few clips of him kind of communicating his story and his faith walk and how he came into the church or into the faith or however you'd want to narrate that. But he said something like, yeah, I was I grew up Catholic and I was a nominal at best Catholic. And that was me too. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up playing music, and I grew up idolizing Green Day and playing, metal and punk shows in Oakland and Berkeley. And I was nominally Catholic doing all the same, but a lot of my friends were atheists and agnostic or just probably aspiring anarchists or something, but definitely just kind of like the societal, like the kids that were kind of societal rejects. At least we thought we all were. It was just, and it was. I remember hearing the name Mark Driscoll when I was like a senior in high school. And that's when my friends who were evangelical were starting to invite me to the youth group. Mm. And I would hear all them talk about, Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. And I'd hear that name quite a bit. And I didn't actually become an evangelical myself until college. And so it was just, it was like, I dove into the culture. I think, I think we say the name like evangelical as if it's a church, like the Catholic Church. But it's like, I'm realizing now as I get older and as I'm just absorbing all of this media about, these different charismatic leaders and stuff like that there is variety and there is not a evangelical church. There is just there's a
like
culture.
It's like a branding.
There's or an arena or I don't know.
Like a movement, there's a lot of different types of evangelicalism. And I grew up in mostly non-denominational evangelicalism, different varieties of it. But
yeah. And so I really enjoy talking to people that grew up the way you did, because most of my friends actually didn't. Even like most of my Christian friends did not grow up that way. A lot of them grew up with some kind of mainline or Catholic tradition, like family tradition. Maybe their parents were the ones that decided, I don't know if we really need this anymore. And then the kids grow up with no religion. And then, but then with you, and then, my best friend, Nathan, like he grew up in, probably the same neighborhoods you did in Phoenix and probably going to, Baptist churches or whatever. And, that's a culture I thought I was supposed to like dive into when I became a Christian. Mm-hmm. And I did. I really did. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
So you dived into these things. So what has been sort of your perception of the Mars Hill podcast now, being involved in these evangelical churches and still active in sort of these churches? Like, how are you sort of responding to that, especially in sort of this idea where Mark Driscoll, and I don't know if you've ever been to his church. He has one in Scottsdale now.
Yeah.
Have you been there?
No. But one of my good friends, it's a realtor here in Phoenix. He goes there because I think he listened to Mark when he was going to the church we were all attending at one point. Mm-hmm. And he was a friend that I made at that church, and he really liked Mark. And I think he's going to that church with his wife now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So his sort of whole movement was trying to get young men to go to church and be Christian men, get wives, have children, support your family, and sort of really tried to aim towards this masculine bent of evangelicalism. Like, so as you're listening to that, how'd you process through all of that?
It's tough because that there is sort of a timbre to the narration of that podcast. Like that story was told to make Mark look like a monster. And look, do I have to be like PG or?
No.
No, he's probably a dick in real life. He's probably, I am too sometimes. I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't think, and it's funny because then I listen to the Unbelievable thing. Do you listen to Unbelievable podcasts at all or?
I listen to some of them. I'm not I've never been an avid listener, but briefly when I was going through my early deconstruction, when I'm just trying to listen to all these debates, I would listen to some every so often.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't always either. That's not one of my like staple podcasts,
yeah.
Some of the
interesting.
names, some of the names are just like, whoa, okay, like I want to. That sounds cool. Like I'm gonna listen to that. And not all of them though. A lot of them just are kind of like the science ones. Like, man, I'm gonna be honest. I'm not the biggest science guy. Like,
are you anti-science or just don't get?
Yeah,
just don't like? You're
I am.
anti-science?
No, I'm kidding. No, I'm not. It's just I'm not.
It's okay if you are. You know, you can be.
I'm
honest.
too feminine to like science. No, I'm kidding. Sorry, I didn't. I didn't want to go there. I do like the softer kind of more of the liberal arts type of. I'm definitely more of a philosophy guy than science, or at least more of a literature and history, as opposed to science. More of like the. Anyways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So he, the host of that show, he posted a archived episode where he interviewed Mark, and I want to say it was probably when Mark was in his prime back in. Maybe just before 2010 or in the early 2010s. And yeah, Mark was a dick. Like he was just, I was like, man, I would like, it's more than that. Like, I don't know if that's like inappropriate for a pastor communicating with someone that way. I think I would get into a fight if anybody talked to me that way. Like, it's like, no, Mark, I don't care if you're talking to me that way. I'm going to like, this is going to be bad for you if you keep talking to me that way. Like,
he's rough around the edges for sure.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's part of this show. What do you think?
I think it probably is. At least a part of it. It's a sort of brand. It's a sort of outrageous behavior that like it gets people talking. Like people either love you or hate you, you know. And I mean, I really didn't. I've heard Mark Driscoll's name before I listened to the podcast, but I really didn't know much about him outside of like, I've heard his name before. And so I haven't really been able to look and see the progression of like, where did he start and where did he go? Because I think that would give me a better sense of like, is this some show that's being put on? I mean, it sounds like it a little bit from the podcast where they were talking about that one clip where he like screams like, how dare you? Like it seemed like from the way they made it sound, it was something meant to go viral. And so it does seem like there's a potential that it could be a bit of a show. But that's where it's hard. And for me, sort of where, like, yeah, I would hear Mark say things and be like, oh, gosh, that's a lot. But it's also just one tiny piece out of how many hours of archived things that he's done. So is that all that he does, or is that the perception I'm getting because that's how it's being edited? I don't know.
Yeah. I know it's funny because I watch, obviously as a hobby, I'm into fighting. Like I grew up wrestling, and it's also like my family, it's a family sport and stuff like that. And so for anyone that watches the UFC or even like pro wrestling as for that matter, you understand that in order to market yourself to who you're trying to, because fighters aren't trying to market themselves to women,
right?
In any culture around the world, they're not really, especially men. Even female fighters, I don't know if they're trying to market themselves to women, but maybe they are. But yeah, the biggest names that you think of in the UFC would be Conor McGregor, right? Mm-hmm. What do people know him as? Even casual fans, like, who the fuck is this guy? Like that's, it's like, that's so I don't know. I feel like there's some kind of that kind of thing where it's like I have to act this way, otherwise I'm not going to draw the crowds that I do. I wonder, and that's not right. That's, in fact, I'm not going to give any charity to that, but that's probably what's going on there, and I think that's what you're picking up on.
I mean, you're sort of a fighter. You've kind of got that personality. You're a young guy. Probably what Mark was aiming at. If you saw that, do you think that would have been appealing for you at any age? I think so. Yeah?
Yeah.
Do you think it would be good that it's appealing to you, or?
So the thing is, we can't, that's the problem I had with the podcast is I think it made its critiques, and the critiques were that, okay, there's a problem that exists in this evangelical church culture where there exists the power for a pastor to pastor with that much of a following and that little of accountability.
Right.
So there's that, and then also there was just, well, this guy was a dick, and people like that. So that, I mean, it's kind of like, well, was he the problem or was culture the problem? Because it's kind of not his fault that people like that, right?
Yeah.
Or
complicated mix of things, because it did seem like there was a lot of people who liked that, and I mean, he still has a church today. There's still people following him, even in the wake of, you know, what some people would see as controversy. I mean, it's weird because, yeah, that's sort of his sin, right? Being arrogant, being controlling, and a lack of accountability, you know, and then a little bit of yelling, which is not good by any means, but it's not in the same realm of, say, like sexual or physical abuse within the church. Like, all of them are bad, but there's just this sort of different thing. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, like, I know that growing up, I had been in churches where you had leaders who sort of lacked that accountability. Like, they weren't a dick like Mark Driscoll. And so, and their church wasn't that big, but like, I think there's patterns of sort of these things where like big leaders in the church, or like not even big leaders, just leaders in the church, finding ways to fudge the accountability to kind of follow God and do what they think he wants them to do. It gets very tricky. And I think something that the Mars Hill podcast did highlight is how little of that really exists within non-denominational structures. There's just there's no like official power structure or checks and balances that we can look to kind of figure those things out.
Yeah. No, that's like, okay, yeah, it's like, as an evangelical, it's kind of like one of those like, all right, yeah, like, point taken.
I don't mean it as like an attack. I just like, I mean, I grew up in all of those churches and I know them very well. And yeah, I think it's that thing where they're so new, like especially the non-denominational, they don't have this built up system. And so they're working out the kinks, they're working out these things, they're trying to create a structure. It just hasn't totally formed yet, so there's chaos. And so, yeah, it's just sort of interesting. But I mean, I think outside of all of it, it was just really interesting, this idea of, you know, the masculine and feminine, and it's like, is this sort of like burly, like angry energy really like what encompasses masculinity? Because for me, it seems a lot more complicated than that, but that was sort of his way of targeting that towards men to sort of fight what was seen as a feminine energy in evangelicalism.
Yeah, and so, I mean, maybe this is something, I mean, this is probably be a great thing to talk about with you being a woman, just like what is, because, all right, so you asked me like, is it a good thing that you were probably drawn to that? And it's like, well, maybe not, but that exists. Like that market exists with or without Mark Driscoll, because then it shows up in the form of Joe Rogan, or it shows up in the form of silly UFC fighters. It's going to show up, I think. Now, I think, you know, there are phrases I hear a lot today, like toxic masculinity. A part of me is thinking that is trying to figure out like, well, maybe what does that mean? Like, is there some of that? Is there some like toxicity? And, you know, I don't know. I do think about that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that men should be only masculine. I don't think that human beings should be only something. And I hear people talk about masculine and feminine energies. And I've even heard Jordan Peterson talk about those things before. And I just, to be honest, I just think that those categories exist in sort of these ideal concepts, but they don't really play out perfectly in human beings.
No. Well, and that's, I think for myself, it's not that I feel unfeminine, but I think on the spectrum, I do have certain things about my personality that tend towards the masculine. And so I always sort of feel like an outsider. I think especially when I was in evangelicalism, a super outsider, because there was a lot of things that were marketed for women, women's events, and all of these things, and I always felt out of my realm in them. But I never felt in my realm in some of the extreme masculine things either. I'm not super sporty or competitive necessarily, but I like talking big questions. Have an entrepreneurial spirit. I do filmmaking and stuff. Those are all sort of things that tend towards the masculine, at least in a certain respect. And so it's hard to get to that place where it's like, what does that even mean to really be feminine or masculine? Like, and how do you embody that well? And there's this whole idea too, where it's like, I grew up like in the big popularity of feminism. And there's this cultural story that tells us, no, you don't have to be just one thing to be a woman. You can have it all. And it's like, yeah, maybe, but is that like and not that I'm unhappy with my life. I'm very happy with my life and I enjoy what I do. But yeah, there's always that sort of question where it's like, is there a story that I'm buying into that like I could potentially live another narrative that embodies more of the feminine journey and the feminine story and be more happy? It's really hard to say.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, going back to sort of churches, do you think that sort of the general evangelicalism, like, do you think it appeals to women more? Because that was sort of the charge, at least the podcast was making a bit on why Mark Driscoll became very popular, is because he was doing something different. Do you think there's more of an like inclination for women in those sort of movements?
Yeah, so that was a point that he made, was, he's stepping into Christianity and he goes to some sort of Christian, what would you call those things? Like the things where you take notes and, what do you call
Conference?
those? Like a conference, yeah. Man, that's bad. It's a little late in the day, and yeah.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, no, he was at probably some kind of Christian conference, and he was experiencing sort of the cultural femininity, and according to him, people showing emotion, hugging and weeping, and the timbre of the songs wasn't Metallica, I guess, and he saw a problem with that because, and I don't know. Sometimes I see a problem with that too. Again, I will step back from the statement of like the evangelical church is sort of feminine in nature, or more so catering. It has sort of a more of a feminine type. I will obviously nuance something like that if I were to say it now.
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't, but I get what he's talking about though, because even guys from my gym, like they probably think me as a little less masculine or a little less tough because I'm a Christian, because I'm religious. So, I mean, I don't know. Like that idea comes from somewhere, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because I've sort of been thinking about the differences between more traditional religion and then these more modern evangelical movements where, and I'm moving into orthodoxy. And I was reading a book by Frederica Matthew Green, and she was talking about her journey going to orthodoxy. And her husband had this experience where, he goes to a Vesper service and he's just like, this is true. Like, this is the thing I want to be a part of. And it's just like changed. And she's just standing there going, my feet hurt. like, I don't want to be here. And she talks about how a lot of women have sort of this feel with orthodoxy where their husbands drag them into it. And a lot of them eventually see the beauty of it. But there's something masculine about it, I guess, or that draws men to it. And so there's this weird dynamic where it's like, okay, I look at something like Catholicism or orthodoxy, and on the outside, there's a huge piece of it that's very feminine. You've got the icons, you've got the gold, the incense, there's all these like very intricate, beautiful details. Yet there is something about the demands and the fasting calendars and all of these things that is like there's a piece of it that's masculine. And where in some of the modern churches, and maybe not all of them, but there is more of like a sort of a power and awe aesthetic visually that to me feels more masculine, or at least trending that way. But when it comes to like the experience, I think it does feel a little feminine the more that I like resonate with it, because it's a lot of personal journeys and feeling the emotions of the music and like that sort of relational aspect with Jesus. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know much about Orthodox masses. I know quite a bit about Catholic masses, and that it's tough to say because on a shallow, I can't describe these things in shallow ways.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to like Protestant or evangelical churches, they're all different. Like they are, like the popular church here in Phoenix is CCV, and their big thing is they want to obviously target, suburbia, right? And so they're going after suburban dads. Like that's who they're really trying to reach. And because their philosophy is if you reach the fathers of families and you get them to commit, then their whole family will follow. And yeah, I mean, that probably works. I think, right? Like,
well, that's an interesting thing too. How do you feel about some of these ideas of like creating marketing strategies to get people to come to church?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think about too. Is sometimes I'm like, do you have TikTok at all?
No, my sister send me TikTok every now and then, just being like, "Oh, here's a funny one," but I don't have it myself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit that I have TikTok, and yes, like it started because my brother was sending me them, and I was like, all right, I guess I'll just download it so I don't have to keep, opening these links. But then I downloaded it, and then the algorithm starts to distribute stuff. So,
do you get lots of dancing videos? Is that your algorithm?
Oh, it started that way, and then I was like, all right, I really can't be watching middle school girls dance for that long as a 28-year-old man.
Yeah, it's probably questionable.
Yeah, it's not like rewiring my mind in the right way. So no, it's the algorithm weeded that stuff out. So now it is a lot more of like things that are. So I get a lot of like Christian ones and like atheist ones, or kind of more like political ones or whatever. And a lot of it is, I mean, like social media feeds us more information than we want already.
Yeah.
TikTok is not helping any of that, And so like that's probably not any better for mental health than any of the other platforms out there. And yet I have it. So, maybe I'll learn the hard way. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the food fights that I see going around, because you have the ability to like, people could put out a clip, right? And then somebody could see that clip and like stitch it, right? Where they can like have it play for a few seconds, and then you come in with your like, all right, the problem with that is, and so one of the food fights that I see are like Catholicism. And Catholics, it seems like they're always trying to reach Protestants. And to me, I just question, like, because as someone who's been evangelical, having grown up nominally Protestant. Nominally Catholic. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I've spent the last 11 years trying to reach, and more often than not succeeding, I will admit, secular people of no church affiliation, people, because that's what Christianity calls us to do, to some degree, and I've just questioned, and I've just had this thought of like, why it doesn't seem like these Catholics that I'm seeing on TikTok, they're doing that. They're more so concerned about Protestant, like correcting these issues of sola scriptura or, and it's like some of these things are kind of like, oh, well, you guys have 2,000 denominations. See, that's the problem with Protestantism. And I'm like, all right, I was Catholic. Do not try to pretend like you guys are all on the same page and you guys are unified. Like, I know that is not true. Yeah. You're selling me some fool's gold here, but it's a nice idea, and I hope that one day we all get there. But anyways. So the thing is, I became an evangelical because evangelicals reached out to me. Mm-hmm. So whatever the marketing strategy was there, Catholics never did that. Mm-hmm. And whether theologically that is right or not, I don't know. Like, and you could go into the Calvinist way of thinking and be like, okay, well, God predestined that. It's like nobody takes credit for that. It's okay, fine, whatever. But like, I'd never, in my experience as a Catholic, I didn't feel like they were doing anything. And maybe that just had something to do with the geography I grew up in or the time frame, maybe in the 90s. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's any better today. But I don't know. Debbie, do you have any thoughts? Because you grew up not Catholic. So you grew up with no kind of like liturgical tradition that's ancient, right? So,
and I wouldn't say I was anti that, but I definitely was uncomfortable with it. It just never resonated with me. Like, I've been to Mass before. My brother-in-law, actually, he goes to a Protestant church with my sister, but he identifies as Catholic because he grew up Catholic, came back to a faith through Protestant evangelicalism, but eventually went back to the Mass and really just loved the tradition and all of those things. So for him, he sort of loved that. So I'd been to Mass with him, and it was just sort of like, I'm standing, I'm sitting, I don't know, what am I supposed to do? And that was probably when I was living in the Bay Area, I was probably 21 or something. So maybe it would have been different going to Catholic Mass at 27 or 28 or something. But so it just never really resonated with me. And even sort of these evangelical ways of trying to get tradition or liturgy, where you do like ritual prayer nights, where you write prayers in sand and do all this stuff. I was like, this is weird. What are we doing? Like, I don't know. It didn't resonate with me. But I think after I went through deconstruction and sort of came back to Christianity, there was just a lot of like coming back and being part of communities that were very similar to what I grew up in. Because when I was in Australia, I did a lot of denomination hopping, just trying different denominations, trying to get out the preconceived notions of what I thought all of those denominations were. And there was a lot of good to that. But I eventually kind of went back to sort of non-denominational evangelicalism. And I really tried very hard to, just get back to that, because I knew that being a part of a body was important after sort of being away for it for a long time, like in a consistent way. I was like, okay, I understand that there's a good to that. And I didn't want to be the consumer where I'm like, I'm going to find a church that fits everything I want it to be. It's like, that's not how I thought church worked. And so I went where I thought I could be most useful. I think I went through deconstruction during college. So to go to a church that was aimed at college kids, it was like, well, if someone's going through the same thing that I did, at least I can be helpful, because I wish I could have had somebody to be that. So that's sort of where I planted. But there was all of these little things that were so normal to me that started to kind of feel off. Not wrong, but it was just like, do we really know what we're saying when we say all these things? And we talk really certainly about certain things that I'm not quite sure we should be so sure about from the pulpit, or certain things. And it was just this wrestling of like, okay, I'm seeing these issues and I have to recognize what are me issues, what are church issues, and find that way to like work with the church to deal with them, so I had to deal with me first. And then if I ever got a chance to talk about the other issues that I was seeing, then great. But if not, like, just deal with me. And I mean, I gained a lot of things from being part of those communities. But at the end of the day, I got to the place where I started to realize the fight that was happening within me was way more detrimental to me than I recognized. And it took going to another Protestant church. I think it was actually in Portland. Went to a Protestant church there, and I always described the experience as it felt like I had been treading water. And then for the first time in a long time, I realized, I'm in this shallow end and I can stand up and I can breathe.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, all of these things, these outside things, these little things that were sort of, I was unsure about and wrestling with, were just taking away the idea of like what it meant to like participate well in spirituality. So at that point, it was like, okay, I'm not running. I'm not going to go away, but I'm going to be open to something else.
Well, do you feel like there was a point in time where you could, so so the point of peace or whatever was that, did you analogize that more with being able to stand up in the water or being able to swim?
Well, I think for me, it was like the first time where it's like I was working so hard to try to make this work and figure it out and like stay above water. And then I recognized for the first time, it's like, oh, I don't have to kick like this.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I can be in a place where I'm not bothered by a lot of the things around me and having to wrestle with those things in myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not gonna run from where I'm going, but I'll be open to another church. Like just so that a place that is better at where I am now. And I thought it would be another Protestant church, but that was around the time where I started meeting all these Orthodox people. Yeah. And realizing, oh, I don't know anything about Orthodoxy, and, you know, little seeds here and there. And then I eventually had a friend just tell me, hey, well, why don't you just go to a service? I was like, okay. And I didn't think I'd like it. But I went to a Vesper service, and, you know, that experience that Frederica Matthew Green's husband had was very similar to the experience I had. Just this, I don't know, there was just this quietness to all of it. And, like, I didn't understand what was going on, but I just recognized there was a depth there. I could just sense it. And then I had a conversation with the priest that, like, every answer that I got, it left me satisfied, more satisfied than the answers that I was getting in Protestantism. Yeah. And, like, those things made sense to me, but it was just, I was like, it was the first time where I was feeling like I wanted to explore religion, not in a skeptical place. Yeah. And, like, after that service, it was basically like, I don't know what this is, but I need to learn it more, and I just don't feel comfortable calling myself a Protestant. Yeah. And so from then, I've been doing the Orthodox thing as much as I can. I had to stop for a little while during COVID, and then I was streaming for a Protestant church for a while and started to recognize, and actually one that I grew up in pretty much from like my middle school age to before I left to the Bay Area for college. And so it was sort of like revisiting the roots of where I came from. And after that first Orthodox service, every other Protestant service I went just felt, it felt hollow. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I do still have a lot of respect for Protestantism, and I do think there's a lot of like unity that needs to happen with all of these different denominations. But yeah, it just never felt like as full. And so I was like, well, I got to try something. And then maybe 6 months ago, I went to a Protestant church, your Protestant church, and realized I wasn't Protestant anymore. I was like, oh, I don't believe in sola scriptura. I don't believe in the phrase by faith and faith alone. It's like not even in our Bibles. Like there's just certain things where it's like, I can't, I just don't believe it. And like, it kind of left me like, well, what do I do now? So I'm not Orthodox yet, but I'm moving towards it. And I don't know, it was interesting just listening to the Mars Hill podcast, because I was never in anything.
I mean, did you feel like a sense of nostalgia at all when you were listening to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say nostalgia because it's so negative in a lot of ways, right? Like, so it's not like, oh, like tons of great things. Like,
but some of the names, though, you know, like a lot of the names being thrown around and stuff. Like, well, I didn't grow up on that, but you did. That's why I was kind of like, I wonder, like.
Well, there were some nostalgia where it was like, okay, and I still listen to Protestant things. Like, I'm not that sort of person where it's like, no, it's like I've always sort of been that person where it's like, I will listen to anybody. It doesn't mean that everything that they're coming out of their mouth I necessarily believe or I'm going to believe, but you know, like I'll listen to it and I think you can get something out of it. So I still listen to some of those people, and there were some things that were like, oh yeah. And my dad, you know, he's a Calvinist, and so a lot of those Reformed people, I'm sure he has. Well, I know some of them he has like good connections with, and so there was that part of it. But there was also a part of me that was just like, it was caught back in that place where it was like the struggle, and I more felt relieved that I wasn't in that place anymore, and that I feel like Orthodoxy has given me the answers to a lot of the things that they were struggling with in those, like the questions in those, in the podcast.
Like, what are some of those things?
Well, I think sort of like the cultural adjustments and like creating a church around comfortability for people outside of culture. I recognize there's a place for that, and I wouldn't want people to stop that. But I also, I think I've gotten to the place where it's like, if you are designing a church around a certain time in a certain place in a certain culture, you're always going to be out of date because the culture's changing so fast that it's always eventually going to fall apart. And what I like about Orthodoxy, which is hard for me to believe I'm saying it, but there is something about them not caring about the culture and really holding on to the sacredness and the tradition that's so deeply rooted, like in the practice. So for them, there's still a show there, right? Like there's incense and there's things going on, but it doesn't feel like a show curated for me. It feels like we're doing this because we're continuing the legacy that has happened before, and we're allowing God to come and work in that, and we trust that he will, as opposed to trying to use my brain to make something that will work and bring people in. And I think for me, there's a level in which the participation in that is just different, and there's certain structures that, give me a sense of, like, even if I can't in my head get fully on the beliefs of something, these different practices can help teach me and refine me something, and eventually maybe get me closer to understanding what's true intellectually. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it definitely does. Yeah, I know. I mean, that's an idea that I do wrestle with too, because, I mean, like I said, in my own story, I became an evangelical because I was reached out to, so that I could tell my story and say God reached out to me, whereas it seems like that's, I don't know, is that a point of contention when it comes to like the liturgy? It's like, well, no, you're supposed to reach out to God. It's like, well, okay, all right. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm not even understanding that dynamic the right way, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. So Orthodoxy is very different than Catholicism, even though they kind of look the same. From what I understand, and I don't know enough about Catholicism, but from what I understand, they have distinct differences, although they're probably closer to each other than certain types of Protestantism and Orthodoxy. But they're very much believers in God's sovereignty, and that God works in a lot of different ways, and and it's sort of hard because to talk about Orthodoxy, you have to go to even different plane, because Catholicism, like Western Christianity, Catholics, Protestants, it's the work versus faith, and sin being sort of this judicial frame. Orthodoxy doesn't really see it that. It's more life and death. Like the whole participation with God, with communion with God, brings you life, and sin brings death into the world. And so like it's the avoidance of death. And so throughout our lives, we're all continually being saved through living life and learning this idea and these patterns of life versus death. And so they're not very they don't try to sway people. When I talked to my priest the first time when I went to the inquiry class, like, this is not going to be a hard sell. We're here to answer all your questions. If you want to become Orthodox, we're happy to help you move towards that. We obviously think this is the church, but we believe God works in a lot of ways. The church is always here, so do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
And so it's just a different mindset, because in their world, like, God works in a lot of different ways, and there's different ways that he's saving everybody, and it's not our job to like necessarily save anybody. There is like an evangelical bent where they want people to know God and come to church and those things, but it just sort of more in live a life that produces more life. And we believe that these traditions that have been handed down teach us how to live the best life, and it'll be contagious, and people will be drawn to it. So it's not as much about the propositional, like, I believe Jesus died and rose again. There is a part of it that's right belief, but it's also sort of right practice, and those things coming together that's what really will bring life. And so they're more participation first.
Yeah, I will say there is probably an advantage I had of growing up Catholic that makes it easier for me to be a Protestant, I will admit. But yeah, and it is interesting because I see a lot of people more and more in these days deconstructing, and I'm kind of, to be honest, I'm getting a little tired of that phrase because just because everybody means it in a different way, it seems like, based on the stories I hear. Some it's like, I was this, and then, I read Richard Dawkins, and then I became obsessed with science, and then I realized that I cannot reconcile science with my propositions about how the world came physically into being. And then it's just like, I have a problem with your political stances. In fact, more often than not, I have a problem with your political stances.
Yeah.
And it's and I don't think it was that way with you. And I also don't feel like you're telling your story of deconstruction the same way I hear a lot of people telling it. And so a lot of people, it's like the #Evangelical. It's like, all right, you guys are not like a church. You guys would probably disagree with each other more than you disagree with me on most things, I think. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, is there something about the evangelical movement that took place in maybe our parents' generations or the generation prior that led to this epidemic we're seeing of like deconstructing believers? Maybe it's just non-denominational evangelicalism is just faulty, and it's something that's easy. But like, I think that sometimes, but then I'm also like, well, a lot of the Catholics, quote unquote, that I grew up with, they didn't need to deconstruct. They just went to high school.
Yeah.
It was like, so what's going on? It's like, I think about that often. And, and I will say, I actually almost went to an Orthodox service not too long ago.
Oh, really?
So yeah, my girlfriend, and is now my fiance, one of her classmates from her med school program is a Coptic, and she was from Central Valley, California, but her family was actually refugees from Egypt, which I thought was really cool. And she said, we talked about some things, and it was surprising to me when I asked her, when we talked about our Christianity, there wasn't much disagreement theologically, but it was more so that wasn't really topics that they talk about that much. I thought that was kind of neat. Yeah. It was more of just like just kind of how we interact in life and kind of how we congregate as a church and stuff. And yeah, she invited me to come to a Coptic service, and it didn't happen, but I'd be open to that. But
yeah.
Anyways, what was I saying before that? I said the thing about Catholics and they just went to high school. Yeah, I'm sorry. I made a point with that, but I forget.
Yeah. Well, I think you were trying to say what is it about? Because there is this pattern of evangelicals deconstructing, right? I have a whole bunch of thoughts on that I haven't fully cleared in my head.
I know. Maybe we got to do this again. Like, yeah, I love talking about this because I am exploring it. And anyways.
Well, I always try to be careful too, because I don't want to sound like I'm just like crapping all over Protestantism or the thing that I came from, because I still do have a respect for it. I credit it for a lot of what it gave me in a love for God and a pursuit for Him.
And a part of it will never leave you, right?
No.
Like the Catholic in me will never leave me. Like it won't. It's part of just my culture. Like I'm Hispanic partly, like I can't completely get that out of me.
No, I always say there's still a part of me that's an evangelical, and there's still a part of me that's Protestant, even though I'm not those things anymore. I do think Orthodoxy is changing me in a way that nothing else ever really did. I think evangelicalism is very culturally, at least the expressions in America, is very culturally American. And so I was an American Protestant, it just, there's not a lot about that is different from outside culture, really, except that they're more puritanical. But I think there's there's something about the way that evangelicals have a passion for God and for standing for truth that's amazing, and it's contagious.
Yeah.
And like I think for myself, when I look at the two, Protestantism and the way that I practice it, and Orthodoxy, I don't think I was following a different God.
Yeah.
But I do think that this thing that I found now feels a lot fuller than anything else that I'd ever come across before. And that's why I continue moving towards it. But I've heard it this way, especially sort of in these Pentecostal ways. And it'll be interesting to hear how you feel. But a lot of people have talked about Pentecostalism being sort of like this movement of the Spirit that's like so chaotic that everything's on fire. And so people burn really hot and then die really quickly. And Orthodoxy has a frame where it's like a fireplace, where you can put the flames in and have a place to control those things. And that's where you get a little bit more long-term sustainability versus some of these non-denominational things. Because there's a lot of things where they have these beliefs and these ideas, and they keep getting passed down, but we don't exactly know where they're coming from. They're repeated, but we don't really know the history of them. We don't know the depth of them. And it's not to say that Cradle Orthodox or Cradle Catholics don't have that issue with the liturgies, but there is something a little deeper, and there's a little more conservatism, not in the political sense, but in that trying to hold to something and like say that just because I don't know what this is and what it's for, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a purpose. And I think that helps them a little bit in, creating a little more structure. Now, obviously, Catholicism has had some negative press as of late, and there's a little more bending and adjusting to culture than I think in Orthodoxy. Not that I don't think Orthodoxy has some problems. Like, there's humans involved. There's always going to be problems, but nothing more than other churches. But there is something that I can respect about holding on to that. And I do think from what I've experienced, like when I ask the questions, my priests do seem to be able to explain the depth of them.
You're not asking them to analogize the Trinity, are you?
Not yet. Maybe next week. Well, the Trinity. Okay, so here's my thing about the Trinity. Like, should it matter, like, the truth about that? Yeah. But I feel like getting so caught into that and, like, arguing about that stops you from seeing, like, the whole. Like, it's so teeny tiny that it's like, I think there's bigger things I probably need to be, like, have my mind focused on than trying to get that definition right. Does that make any sense?
So if you grew up a gamer kid like I did, and you like grew up loving the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, then you understood the Triforce, and the Trinity wouldn't be a problem for you. Okay. Because I was a gamer kid, and that was my game. So
the answer to the Trinitarian question is play Zelda.
Yes, I would highly recommend anybody who struggles with that concept.
Yeah.
Definitely grab your N64 controller and invest 10 hours of your life.
Yeah, I've never had a problem with it necessarily, but like there's also, I hear so many people have debates about it that I'm like, should I care more about this? And then I'm like, I'm not going to spin my wheels trying to be like concerned about something I'm not naturally concerned about. Like if I need to look into it, it will eventually come on my salience landscape and I will search it. But it's just not, it's not something that's one of the things where it's like, okay, the Trinity, that's fine. Like I don't need to be a Unitarian or like try to figure out if I should be.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the thing is like, and you know, when you're talking about some of these, I mean, so that problem that you recognize, and I mean, we keep using this word evangelicalism, but I'm gonna keep using it because it makes it easier to talk to you. I almost want to just say non-denominationalism because at least when you have a denomination, it does put some walls because when you're non-denominational, you know, in theory, you could really do whatever you want. I recognize the problem that I don't think you really win the world by trying to look like it. Or I mean, I'm not even going to say like by befriending it, because of course you have to befriend the world. But trying to look like it, but smuggle in, these Jesus stories. I mean, maybe it works. Maybe it works for a little while, but not for centuries, not for, maybe time will prove that to be true.
Yeah.
But I agree with that. And I think that's even like where we see these like reformed movements. Like, and it's funny because when I started listening to Paul Vanderklay, I was hearing he was a Calvinist pastor for a Christian Reformed church. And when I became an evangelical, I had no idea. I had not heard these phrases like Reformed or Calvinist growing up as a nominal Catholic kid, just stepping into. And when I started meeting and interacting with some of these Reformed kids, they were a bunch of little pricks. I swear. I was like, why are you guys getting on my ass about speaking in tongues? Like, what's the big deal? And they were unrelenting dickheads about it. Okay. Like, and I don't know if you have any experience with that crowd, but it's like, why are you guys all wearing fedoras for one? It's like, why are you guys, and I'm being a jerk now too. Okay. I'm gonna be honest, but there's still a little sourness about it. I'm just gonna say, because it's like, that was my experience walking into this whole culture. And I was like, okay, all right. So there's these guys, and then there's us, and I'm sure we both probably have our faults, but like, and now, after, when I did a episode with Paul on his show, and just talking to him and hearing him and his description of, not his description of, I don't know that he typically goes there describing Calvinism. I think he probably actually doesn't like doing that. Yeah. I think he'd rather talk about other things because it's part of his denominational heritage, right? But he's not a dickhead about it, And so I think he actually probably tries to distance himself a little bit from that crowd because he probably has some experience with them. But yeah, I mean, I've wanted to know like the roots of that whole thing, and I think I kind of understand the story, and I think that the Mark Driscoll podcast goes into that a little bit too. But anyways, do you have a thought on that? Since we got on that topic.
Well, my dad's a Calvinist, so I knew about Calvinism. I knew about Tulip, and I went to a private Christian school up until I was 8th grade. So you had to learn some of those things, the church history and all of that. And so I know a bit about it. Probably, I never did the super deep dive in it because at my point where I was sort of searching, I hadn't gotten there yet because I got back to Christianity, and in my mind it was like, well, one of these denominations or beliefs is probably more true than the others. But like right now, I just think there's more essential, important things that I should focus on. And eventually, if I can find something that convinces me to be true, I'd be willing to accept that. And I think now that I've sort of looked at sort of the history, the grander history of Christianity, I see Protestants protested and reformed because they thought the Catholic Church had gone a wrong way. And I think a lot, if I was there at that time, would I have thought that as well? And I probably would have, because I always thought there were certain things in Catholicism that didn't seem right when I looked at everything else. It just didn't seem to all align. But now I'm at the point where it's like, we've reformed, and now we keep just splitting and splintering, and we keep reforming and keep reforming. And maybe instead of reforming, like, there's something on us to return to the original church and try to understand that and see if we can find a participation in that and believe. I think it's going to create a healthier place. It at least has for me than trying to continue down this path of Protestantism, because what I've seen time and time again is you grow up in a certain movement or a certain time of Protestantism, and you get a lot of good from it, but then things are not just right. And so what are you going to do? I'm going to break off, and I'm going to plant a church that's the right way to do it. Like, but then someone grows up in your denomination, and then they break off and do the same thing. And it's like, it seems a lot of that sort of intellectual game of deciding what's good and evil on our own terms, and like what's right and wrong about God on our own terms, instead of letting the history of what came before inform the way that we believe. And something I really do love about the Orthodox is their reliance on the church fathers to give them a sense of this is why we believe what we believe. It doesn't really exist in Protestantism.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So anyways, you use the history of the Reformation to give a pass to the young reformed and restless or whatever kids. So I'll excuse that. But I just wanted to know if you had any knowledge of that, because again, I didn't have many friends that are like that. It's funny because I met a guy when I was still a nominal Catholic, kind of exploring, kind of being evangelized to by evangelicals, and he was an evangelical as well. So he thought we were kind of on the same team or something. And it was, we were at a show together actually in Oakland. My band was playing at it and we were talking about faith. And so I eventually did become a Christian maybe 8 months later. And then I came back and told him about all these things. And he pretty, I don't know how the words to use to describe it, but he was very he harshly critiqued certain ways that I said things, corrected me theologically, and then never talked to me again over Facebook Messenger. And I was like, oh my gosh,
yeah.
And I didn't realize why that was until later. And it's funny because I think that guy kind of deconstructed into some very liberal form of, I don't know, maybe even maybe nothing. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I do think you're right, though. I think maybe the ex-evangelical movement is probably because of the cultural root of Protestantism.
Yeah. And I actually hate that word ex-evangelical. I say it sometimes tongue in cheek because I feel like I no longer identify as evangelical, but I am not what you would assume. When you hear that term, you think very progressive Christian or, spiritual but not religious. And I'm like, I went super traditional.
Yeah, I think you're right. And most people, if they say that they're ex-evangelical, then they're a very progressive Christian. I think people that deconstruct to non-theism or atheism or irreligiousness altogether typically don't say ex-evangelical.
Yeah.
They typically just say none.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think what I have to recognize is that there was a lot of pain in evangelicalism and also these other types of Christianity. So I grew up non-denominational Christian, so we didn't like any of the denominations, right? Or we had preconceived notions. I wouldn't say we didn't like them, but the Baptists, they don't dance, they're weird. Catholics, do they even believe in the same God? We don't know. Mormons are weird, and most people wouldn't consider Mormons a part of Christianity. But it was just these ideas that we had, and then you really started thinking about it. It's I don't know anything really about Baptists. I know a little bit about Catholicism, but probably some straw man version that, was handed down to me by people who were sort of burned by Catholicism or whatever, there's just not true understanding. And so I think for me, it was kind of getting to that place where I was testing my assumptions about a lot of those things. And so I have to look at it and say, man, I participated in this system for a long, long time. And I was in support and moving towards those things. I was in leadership in youth groups and certain things and trying to play these same games to get kids interested in church so they love Jesus. And I don't feel guilty about my participation in it necessarily. I don't think it was with bad intentions, but I do now think I thought that would work, but I don't think it does anymore. Not in a full sense of what's going to give people the best chance to have that long-term, sustainable, communion with God. I can't say that I think that works because I burnt out of it myself.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to. It wasn't I was looking to get out of evangelicalism. There's so much about it, the core things that I still resonate deeply with. Yet, that was sort of my struggle. It's where I believe these things and I resonate really deeply with all these things, yet it in practice is not. There's something not quite right. And so.
Yeah. So one thing, when I became an evangelical, I did remember reading Mere Christianity. And I probably got like 30% into it. And then I listened to the rest on the audiobook like 7 years later. But it gave me, and maybe like real like diehard fans of that book would correct me on the impression that I got from this, but it gave me, I don't think I'm the only one that came away with this idea, but it gave me this idea that we can all be like the Catholic Church so long as you hold to the truth that Jesus is God. And then that could that can make debates about Christus Victor versus penal atonement okay. Like, those debates were not okay for a lot of history because people died over those debates. Yeah. But that can make disputes about, liturgies between Orthodox and Catholics okay. As long we can all be on the same team as long as that. And part of me still wants to believe that's true. In fact, most of me still wants to believe that can be true, although it's not happening these days. And I don't think anybody wants to give either. I don't think that, these Catholic kids on TikTok that I'm seeing, and most of them are converted Catholics from Protestantism. Yeah. And I see them with that same evangelical rigor that they probably were taught to have to reach kids for Jesus. Well,
and so this is where I think the conversation shifts of like this idea of unity in Christianity. I think I still want to see unity. I don't think that every Catholic evangelical, they're not Christian or they're not communing with the same God that they are in Orthodoxy. I don't believe that. I think at a time I used to think denomination didn't really matter. It was just these essentials. And then the older I got and the more that I participated, I recognized, well, sometimes bad ideas and bad theology and practice are really harmful. So there's good in that. But what happens is you see this spirit in the conversation where it's trying to prove your own ideas versus trying to really understand what's true and go through a journey with people to be like, okay, well, you think this, I think this. Why are we differing? And, you've got this clickbait theology with TikTok and all of these things where you're trying to do these knockdown arguments on 30-second videos about really deep topics. And
they actually extended it to now you could do whole 3-minute videos now.
Oh, okay.
And I actually don't like that as much, to be honest.
Yeah, you're like, next, get this out of my algorithm.
Yeah, that's probably not helping humanity by having these short clips, but anyway.
Well, I think it's so easy to truth is complicated. And so you put these sort of tiny little bits, you can put so much misrepresentation and untruth within these little things and it just goes unquestioned and people are like, oh wow, and it's really bad for the brain, I think. And I think why I try to kind of stay off. I have my own vices with YouTube and social media, but there is just such formation going on with these things. And I think there is something about the evangelical spirit where you're fiery and you want to see people come to truth. And Protestantism is a lot about the propositional of what I can believe in my head, because, it's just faith. I believe Jesus died and rose again, and so therefore I'm saved. And it's not
and that's so weird because when you really understand Martin Luther and his story in the Reformation, that is not what he envisioned. It wasn't we need to get right back to the right propositions, but there was actual practice that that was probably needing reformation. Yeah. Not necessarily an entire church split off, but maybe that was necessary. I'm probably under the impression that it was,
Well, at the very least, it got to that place where it happened, to try to force those things together was probably going to create more division within the church and destroy itself from within than letting people choose. And there's a part where it's when it comes to this idea of if it's just proposition, there's people who maybe want to believe that Jesus is God, but they can't, their brains just won't get them there, and they haven't heard the thing that makes them believe that, or they haven't participated and seen the thing that makes them believe that. And so it becomes very tricky. And I think there's something about orthodoxy where Of course, there's right belief there, right? Like, to be an Orthodox Christian, you have to believe the church doctrines, and they want to make sure that you understand them and you really do believe them before you enter in. But there's a whole bigger portion of just participation, of like being in the liturgy is teaching you something about the story of the resurrection and what it means to have life than just what I can formulate in my theological brain. And they're just much more willing to live in a world of mystery and draw lines where it's like, this is what we believe, like, and we're not going to try to explain it detail to detail. And some people, that drives them crazy. And in part of me, it does drive me crazy. I'm not naturally a mystic. I don't want to.
Is Orthodoxy like very mystical in your experience, or?
It is, but not in sort of the way that I think people get in like a caricature where, you know, there's a lot about the mystery of the church, like the mystery of the resurrection and the Eucharist and all these things. Yet it's not, honestly, Pentecostal services seem more mystical in that sort of caricature than Orthodoxy does. There's a lot more order there, but there's a lot more of being willing to say, you know, it's something about God we don't fully understand, and we do our best to just like participate in the mystery versus trying to explain it all. And that's where I think Reformed theology and the Reformation and all of these divisions in Protestantism have started to become an information religion versus a participation religion.
Yeah. No, I think that is a problem with Protestantism, at least if that is truly the approach, is it's like all about getting your propositions right.
Right.
I don't think that any Protestant actually lives that way. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we think that's what that is, but it's not. We understand very well that it's about the practices. Now, our practices may not have any sort of ancient sort of order to them, but I think we understand that it's what you do is probably more important than your creeds.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think most people, like, whatever you believe, that's more true than not, where really what you do and how you live is much more important than the things that you are professing from your mind or getting intellectually right.
Yeah.
And I do think these conversations are important. Like, if we can come to truth and understanding about what is right theology, it can only help us, if the religion is true, to have a better spiritual engagement and a spiritual well-rounded understanding. But I think it's just this idea that it becomes an infighting where, like, we have the truth, I have to tell you, and so
and you got to correct every little notch in that.
Yeah, whoa, don't say that. And then it's like, whoa, like, it just becomes a lot more complicated there, where we don't see each other as humans and people, and like all of us trying to participate and do our best. And so I don't really know fully the answer to it all. I mean, I think part of this project is trying to figure that out, of like, how do I have better conversations with people who think differently than me, or believe different things than me, and, you know, come to a place where I'm not placating what I'm actually believing, but I'm also being willing to like explore that space and try to figure those things out together.
Yeah. I think the answer to that is always just following Jesus, you know, always. And that sounds so evangelical to me, you know, but like, just no, but I believe it's true. Just always trying to seek, you know, the life of Christ as we know his character to be in the story. Just that, I think that'll always kind of lead you to be able to talk to anybody about anything with a certain amount of respect and, you know, grace and dignity. And yeah, I think so.
And as much as that does sound very evangelical, it's very Orthodox too. That idea of embodying Jesus, like, that's what gives us life, and he's this character of what it means to be truly human. And so I think there's a lot of synergy in those two things, the evangelical, and it often gets sort of caricatured, and like people have a lot of baggage with those words, but I do think if you really read the Gospels and see the things and really look at people who have dedicated their lives to Jesus, independent of what denomination they're at, there's something different for a lot of them. Like there's a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so anyways, I think going back to sort of where we'd started in our conversation, we're talking about something like, you know, the story of Mark Driscoll in the Mars Hill podcast. I mean, the thing is, I don't think that all of those things are bad. In fact, I think there was a lot of good, like this message of like, you know, we could talk about the dynamic of directing your messaging towards men and how you view men in a culture. Like maybe there's problems there, but I think the things that were actually being preached to men were all good things. Mm-hmm. I think men do need, I think we need some more, not assertiveness, but directedness in our lives, because it's too easy to live without a purpose for a man and fall into nihilism. Yeah, it really, really is. Like I could have easily wound up not going to college, not, you know, finding a faith to participate in. I could have easily just been one of those guys that continues to, you know, play guitar and, you know, smoke weed all the time and stuff like that, and kind of stay at home my entire life and maybe one day figure it out. But, you know, I didn't. Like, and that's why I do think I do have a certain amount of appreciation for that sort of influence. And I don't attribute that to Mark Driscoll or anything like that. I'm sure that, but just that, that charge to men. And I think that charge to women too, but that may be different because I think in our society, especially in America, we have different challenges as different genders.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's the hardest thing, seeing a lot of these movements being well-intended. And like, from what it sounds like, it did seem like Mark Driscoll did care for the people he pastored, and he did have a care for, you know, women and the vulnerable. Yeah. Maybe he just branded it in a way that was not the wisest, or who knows? I mean, I think there's a lot more going on there than what could be seen as a simplistic narrative within the podcast. Yeah,
I think, and I wish that the podcast would have actually, like, you know, brought some, I guess, how would you say, like, not resolution, because it did obviously resolve to some kind of ending, but just some sort of, like, you know, at least like, all right, you made some critiques, so propose solutions, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's still going. I think they're still releasing. Yeah, they're still releasing more episodes. So we'll see. I'm interested to see how it finishes, but it's definitely been an interesting journey. Like, definitely flashback to evangelicalism and all of those things. But no, I'm glad you listened to it, because I've been enjoying like unpacking this, because I feel like I've been listening it to my myself and just brewing.
Yeah, I know you wanted to talk about more of like masculine, feminine sort of dynamics and gender maybe, and you know, to be honest, I'm just not. I don't. My opinions on that are still very much like I don't know. They're not very straightforward, to be honest. But yeah, we ended up talking more about denominations and stuff like that. And
well, I think it's all a part of it. Like, there's something underneath that, the masculine and the feminine, and what's happening underneath that. Like, I don't think either of us can probably express it, but there's something going on under there that is dealing with those things. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was like, well, let's start there as a jumping off point and see where it goes. That's how all my conversations go.
It went a few places.
Yeah, but it was very interesting. Yeah. Do you have any sort of last thoughts before we call it a day?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
No, I would love to do this again. This is always fun talking to you about some of these things, because most people that I know don't care to talk about this stuff for that long. So well, not even my fiance. She does not like talking to me about this stuff.
That's probably good for you. Yeah. You need someone to like be like, you know, chill out.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right. Well, thanks, Christian. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Cassidy.
Thank you so much for watching. Like always, I will close the Serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.